All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Friday class. It's good to be back in person with everyone, although I see a lot of empty seats today. So I imagine a lot of folks will be watching this on video later on today or this weekend. So for all you watching in video, hi. We're gonna pick things up today where we've left off. We've been talking about the skeleton system generally in terms of the structure of our bone tissue. We're going to move in to talk about some of this bones specifically today. And then we're going to wrap things up with a little bit of a change of pace and talk a little bit about who owns your body tissue. Some interesting stuff there. So in advance of class today, you had some readings to do in the textbook to kind of get you set up for class today, as well as a short survey asking you to reflect on your first quiz grade and giving me some information about how that format and whatnot worked for you. Before we go ahead and dive into today's agenda, what questions do you have? It's so much better to ask for questions here than on Zoom. And then there's like the silence when nobody has, I love it. That's like my favorite thing. That's like the only reason I teach is just for that moment after I ask for questions and there's silence. It's great. All right, cool. Let's get into it. Today I have a couple announcements to make to get us started. And then I have a bit of because you asked. Again, some good questions came up on Wednesday and I have some answers for you. And then we're going to do a drawing activity because you all love drawing. And then we'll get into the axial skeleton, as I mentioned, and wrap things up talking about tissue ownership. And then I've got a Friday Venn diagram, as promised every Friday. You get a Venn diagram. And we'll have a short ticket out today. So let's do it. A couple announcements. I want to remind you that there's free tutoring. Take advantage of this. This is amazing. You have someone who can sit down and work with you through this class. If you'd like to set this up, contact Chase directly or contact me and I can set you up. It's through the University Bishop Access Program. A couple of you have emailed me for study tips and things like that. And my first response is going to be to set up time working with the tutor. So take advantage of that. If you have any questions at all, let me know. Also, the textbook, edition 9, this guy right here is now available in Beagley Library for you too. I thought I had that set up at the beginning of the semester. I apologize. I had gotten mixed up with the textbook for another class I teach. But this book is now available in Beagley. So if you need it, you can get it there. I will continue to keep the 8th edition in the lab room for you as well, so you can access that. I want to make sure everyone has access to the textbook. The reading for this class is essential and really important. So be sure you're keeping up on that. Last class, a couple cool questions came up about bone and bone structure, and I want to make sure we have some answers. The first was, what's the deal with bird bones? And I did a little bit of research, and it's actually kind of surprising in that there was one paper in particular that compared the structure of bird, bat, and rodent, I think maybe mouse bones, and found actually that bird bones were the most dense of all of them. And by dense, I don't mean that the density of the entire bone, but I mean like this thin layer of compact bone is really, really dense. And what that does is that provides them this really high strength to weight ratio. So it's really dense, so they can have less of it and it can still be really strong. Now notice in this bird bone too, you have this really thin layer of compact bone in this really enlarged area of spongy bone compared to human bones. Notice also that the spongy bone is really spongy. There's a lot of giant air pockets in here, and these are called pneumatic bones. So essentially, they have air cavities in them. We have some examples of this in humans, so we're going to study the bones of the skull coming up, but you have sinuses. Your sinuses in your skull bones are pneumatic bones. They're bones that have air pockets in them, and lots of bird bones have that. So what they have here is this kind of model where the bone structure that is there is really dense, but there's these giant air pockets. And so they can be large bones and they can be really thin, but also really strong at the same time. Because for birds, weight is so important, because the heavier you are, the more energetically costly it is to fly, as you can imagine. So really cool example there. Anyone's really interested in this kind of stuff, take vertebrate anatomy. I'm not sure if I'll offer it this fall or not, but it's usually offered in the falls. Zoology 331. We talk a lot about this kind of stuff. So it's cool. That's a plug. I teach the class. So, all right. The other thing was some questions about osteoporosis and menopause. So this is really interesting too. So I gave some answers in class that I said I was a little bit unsure about and I wanted to check back. And in fact, I was correct that primarily osteoporosis associated with menopause is due to changes in hormone levels, specifically a drop in estrogen. which what it ends up doing is at the end of the day, it increases the function of this drop in estrogen, increases the function of osteoclasts. So remember, there's 4 kinds of bone cells. One of them is osteoclasts, and osteoclasts break down bone, and it decreases the function of osteoclasts. So osteoblast function goes down, osteoclasts go up. And so the end result is that you have more bone tissue being broken down than is built up. And you can see the progression in an example here. That spongy layer becomes more and more, what's the word I'm looking for? Less and less dense, right? And those pockets between those trabeculi get larger and larger. What ends up happening is the bone then loses strength and is brittle and can easily be broken, which of course can cause a whole bunch of health problems. You also asked, is it reversible? And the answer is no, it's not. Once it starts to happen, you can slow it down. You can even basically stop the process, bless you, through fitness, through food, there's certain medications that can help with it as well. But once you get to a point, you can't go back. You can't increase the density of the bone. And so that's why it's really important to set yourself on that proper trajectory from like a young age, making sure you're getting much calcium in your diet, et cetera, et cetera. Say hand, and it's, what's your name?
I keep forgetting my name.
Okay, can you, remind me your name again?
Sarah.
Sarah, okay, sorry, Sarah, I'm still working on this. Go ahead.
So you said the drop in estrogen that causes those bones to become more brittle?
Exactly.
How come males don't have that issue? Because obviously they have more testosterone.
That's a great question with less estrogen. I don't know. The short answer would be because those hormones have different effects in males and females in some ways. And so males don't experience this sharp drop off in estrogen levels. They kind of always have low estrogen levels. And so it doesn't have as much of a large effect. It's a little bit of a vague answer. I'm not sure exactly the details there, but the gist of it is that there's just differences in how different sexes respond to that levels of that hormone. Yeah, it's a really good question. Maybe I should get back to you on that one too. Any other questions, thoughts, comments, ideas, ways that we can reverse osteoporosis? You'd be like super famous if you could do that. All right, go ahead, grab your notebooks, grab a piece of paper. Here's a review activity then, as best as you can from memory. So don't look at your notes, you have 2 minutes. I want you to draw a long bone and label as many parts on it as you can. No peeking, just on your own as best you can. Actually, those of you watching the video later, I'll just leave this on and leave the timer on so you can give yourself 2 minutes as well. Ooh, that was loud. All right, next, go ahead. We're going to take 2 more minutes, and I want you to go ahead and back to your notes and make any changes, updates, additions to your diagram that you need to. Take note of what you're adding and what you already have on. Make sure you've got correct information. If you want to converse and check in with somebody sitting next to you, that's perfectly fine as well. So basically now is just a chance to go back and check your work based on what you do from memory. Make sure you've got it. Cool. All right, let's go ahead and bring this back to the full group. So again, the idea of this activity is just to jog your brain a little bit about what you learned, and also to see what stuff you already know, you can pull out from memory, and what you need to go back and get a refresher on. So you should have drawn a diagram that looks something like this. Remember, your long bones are defined as those bones that are longer than they are wide, essentially cylindrical in shape. And so this is especially the bones of your limbs. So your humerus, your ulna and radius, and your arm are long bones. The bones of your fingers, your phalanges, are long bones. Even though they're small relatively, they still have this general shape where they're longer than they are wide. Your diagram should include, importantly, the epiphyses. So there's a distal epiphysis, and this is the end of the bone that kind of bulges out a bit, right? And the proximal epiphysis, which is the bulge on the closer end to the body. Then you have the shaft of the bone, which is called the diaphysis. You also, if you do make a cutaway of your bone, you've got this compact bone on the outside. Where is that? Oh, the compact bone is not even in this one. Weird. Okay, the compact bone is right here. You should have that labeled as well. I didn't notice that that wasn't in this diagram. You've got your spongy bone, which is all of these trabeculi with pockets in the center of the bone. Then you have this big cavity in the middle called the medullary cavity. Then you have, importantly, you have this layer of connective tissue on the outside called the periosteum. And you have this connective tissue covering all of the surfaces on the inside called the endosteum. So that's the important takeaway from this. Also, sorry, one other thing, you can have your articular cartilage. Remember, this is that hyaline cartilage that covers the ends of the bones at the epiphyses where those bones articulate with other bones. And that provides some structural stability and also reduces friction, importantly, at those joints. So you don't have bone rubbing on bone, because that would, it wouldn't be smooth, right? So you get this kind of grinding action, which is what happens when you have, for example, osteoarthritis. That cartilage is gone, and every time you move that joint, those bones are rubbing on bones, and that sucks. Those are the big takeaways. There's a little more that we'll get into in lab, but those are the big components that I want to make sure you have down from Wednesday's lecture. Questions on that? Yeah, go ahead. The articular cartilage in the femur, no, the articular cartilage in the, at the distal end of your femur, so down here, is still going to be hyaline cartilage, but you have this additional, the menisci of the knee, though that's fibrocartilage, but the bone still also has hyaline cartilage up there. That's a good question. Just as a refresher, remember we're talking about the bone as an organ here, composed of many different tissue types, including connective tissue, including epithelial tissue, and including nerve tissue, because the bone is innervated as well. All right, let's go talk about some specific bones. Let's talk about the skeleton. I should have timed this so we could have done this one right around Halloween. But it's a spring semester, so that really wouldn't work, would it? No, next year. So you guys, you will all take the class again in the fall. We'll come back and we'll do a special. No, in my human anatomy and physiology class I taught in the fall, I did wear like the Phoebe Bridgers style skeleton suit to class on Halloween. It was a good time. All right, the skeleton overall consists of a number of different tissue types, including, of course, bones and cartilages, joints, which are places where bones and cartilage come together. There's connective tissue and other tissues there as well, and ligaments, which bind the bones together and give it some structural support so that they move in the way that we want them to move. We've got about 206 bones in an adult human body, although that can vary a little bit. We'll see why it can vary in a little bit. There's some small bones you can develop that some people develop, others don't. Sometimes certain bones are fused in with some individuals and not others, but it's just over 206 bones is the takeaway. And we can split these bones into two major categories. The first is the axial skeleton, which is basically what's up and down the middle. I'll show you a diagram of this in a minute. So that is your skull, your vertebral column, and your thoracic cage, right? So that's everything axial, meaning down the middle of the body. And there's about 80 bones total between your skull and all of your vertebrae and all of your ribs. There's about 80 bones. Don't worry about these exact numbers. I'm putting these numbers up to give you an idea of how many bones there are. I'm not going to ask you a question, how many axial bones are there? I just don't think that's a very useful information. But I want you to know just generally that a little under half of the bones, total bones in the human body, are in the axial skeleton. And the remaining 126 or so bones are what's called the appendicular skeleton. And that is the bones of the upper and lower limbs. So that's your leg bones going up through here into your pelvic girdle, your shoulder girdle, and your arm bones. Yeah, Brooke.
You might have said this and I might have missed it. But what do you mean by like postcranial axial? Just not.
Oh, I didn't mention. Okay, so we're going to talk specifically in class starting today about the postcranial axial skeleton. That is the axial skeleton minus the skull. That's all it means, is that we're going to look at all of those bones. We're going to save the skull for later, and we're going to have a whole lab on the skull. And so I'm just not going to get into it right now because there's some kind of special things, some unique things about the skull. Also, it's really complicated, so it gets its own kind of special place. So yeah, thanks for asking that. I meant to say that. So let's look at this on another diagram. You can see here the postcranial axial skeleton. So again, everything you see in this kind of lighter color here is the axial skeleton. And so we're looking at everything past the head, basically, for the axial skeleton. And it's composed into two parts. We have the thoracic cage, which is your ribs and your sternum. And then we have your vertebral column, which is all the bones going back here down to the coccyx here. So two major parts. The vertebral column is broken into segmented bones, a series of bones called your vertebrae. So essentially, the postaxial skeleton, we only have three kinds of bones. We have ribs, we have the sternum, and we have vertebrae. Now, there's a bunch of different kinds of vertebrae, but those are the three major categories of bones in the postaxial skeleton. So what we're going to do is walk through each of those in a little more detail, starting with the vertebral column. The vertebral column is, we also call it the spinal column or the spine. Those things are all synonymous. Notice here that it is not synonymous with the spinal cord. The spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and we're going to talk about that later in the semester, and that's composed of primarily of nerve tissue. That travels down through the center of these holes in the middle of the vertebrae. Right now, we're just talking about the bones, which we'll call the spinal column. And in an adult, you've got usually, again, there is a little bit of variation, but we're going to call it 26 total bones. Two of these bones represent fusions, meaning that when you're an embryo, the bones are separate, but as you develop, they fuse together and become a single bone. And those two bones are your sacrum, which is down here, and your coccyx, which is also known as your tailbone. The spinal cord is really important because it transmits the weight of all of your upper body down to your lower body. All of your mass of your arms and head and chest and abdomen go through the spinal cord and into your pelvic girdle, and then are transmitted down to your legs. So it's really important for your physical structure and especially our bipedal stance and locomotion. The spinal cord also serves to surround the spinal, the spinal column serves to surround the spinal cord. And so the spinal cord is this central nervous tissue that goes right down the center of these bones. It's super well protected, and you'll understand why when we get to that. And it extends down from the head at the top here, which you can't see, and goes down to usually right about here. And so this area of the spine here doesn't contain any of the spinal cord inside of it. It has some nerves in there, but not the spinal cord proper. Don't worry too much about those details now. I just want you to know that the spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column. That's the important takeaway here. And finally, one other point is that these bones serve as important attachment site for muscles, both for your head, to move your head and neck so you can nod, and what's this called? Back to nodding, yes. What do you call knowing? Shake. Yeah, thank you. Shaking. That's a tough vocabulary word. I couldn't come up with. I'm a little bit. It's funny. The shingles has made it really, really difficult to sleep. I don't feel terrible. I just can't sleep at night. I was up for like a couple hours in the middle of the night last night, decided to have a cup of tea and read a scientific paper. And so I'm a little bit out of it this morning. I had to get up really early this morning to get the kids out to school and stuff, and just kind of a little bit fuzzy brain. So I apologize if I'm missing some simple words like shaking. But one of the end results of that is I drove my 13-year-old son and his buddy to school. I dropped them off this morning, and I told him my son's friend that I loved him when he was leaving the car. And I was like, well, I did. Well, no, that's not what I mean. Well, kind of, but yeah, it was like, just go have a good day. Anyway, yeah, that's the kind of day that it's going to be today. But hopefully, if it's just like a little bit of extra love, that's not like the worst end result of being sick. All right. Anyway, spinal cord, you see there. And so it's important attachment site for muscles, not only of the head to provide nodding and shaking, right? Shaking, good. But also for all of the back muscles that provide stability to your upper arm movements, as well as flexure at the torso, forward, backwards, all the cool things that you can do. Moving your upper body, all those muscles have some attachment to your spinal column. So let's break the spinal column down in a little more detail here. Actually, do I want to do this now? Kind of wish I set these up a little bit differently, but that's okay. All right. So I want to talk about the 5 major regions of your spinal column. You can see those color coded here. You've got blue on top, you've got green here. This is like a grayish color, a brown, and a light brown. And let's walk through them. On top, you have what are called cervical vertebrae, and there's 7 of them. And they're essentially the vertebrae of your neck. They move from the articulation with your skull down to just about like here, what you kind of commonly consider your neck. The next 12 vertebrae are called your thoracic vertebrae. So they extend from the top of your neck, or excuse me, from the bottom of your neck, basically down to just below where your rib cage ends in your upper back. Then we have 5 lumbar vertebrae. Those are the vertebrae in your back. And then we have the sacrum, which is composed of 5 fused vertebrae. And the sacrum is important because it articulates with the pelvis, the pelvic bones, which you don't see here. But basically, this is where your legs are connected to your axial skeleton. And finally, we have the coccyx, which is your tailbone, which is this little tiny guy down here that kind of curves back in. So one mnemonic device, I think your textbook presents this, but I've seen it elsewhere to remember how many vertebrae are in each region, is the 7, 12, 5 is the times of day where you might eat your meals. So you eat breakfast at 7, you eat lunch at noon, you eat dinner at 5. In my opinion, 5 o'clock is like way early to eat dinner, but whatever. That is a good way to remember it. And so that will come in handy because it allows you to know exactly what vertebrae we're dealing with. So in lab, for example, we're going to have a skeleton. I might have a label on this vertebrae and ask you, what is that one? Now, you're not going to be able to look at that vertebrae and say, oh, that's the T7. But what you can do is you're like, okay, well, I know the first 5 are cervical vertebrae, I count down. The next 12 are going to be thoracic vertebrae, so I can count down. That's going to be T7, boom, you get it. So it is important to know how many vertebrae are in each of those sections. 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, then you got a sacrum and a coccyx. Now, the spinal cord of inferior to sacrum, yeah. That's kind of sad. I like when these words have a double meaning sometimes. It's like inferior to sacrum, like the poor little coccyx is tries so hard. No matter what it does, it just can't live up to its big brother, the sacrum. We all feel that way sometimes. Ethan, go ahead.
So are they based off of where they change their convex or concave?
Oh my gosh, you just set that up. Curvatures of the spine. It's like I have a plant there. Look at that. All right. So there are 4 curvatures of the spine that you should know. The first 2 are the cervical and lumbar curvatures, and they are concave posteriorly, meaning that if you're looking at it from the back, they kind of go out towards your, they kind of bend towards the anterior or towards your belly. And that's the lumbar and then the cervical. The cervical doesn't kind of come back around. It just kind of bends forward a little bit. And then your head rests on top. And then your head kind of provides the counterbalance back the other way, because the most of the mass of your head is kind of posterior to where it articulates with the vertebral column. So you've got those 2 curves, and then you have the thoracic and sacral curves, which are convex posteriorly, meaning they curve towards your back. And so you've got your sacrum, which curves back out towards your posterior, and then in your chest area, you have this thoracic curvature, which goes towards your back as well. So the spine is this kind of, it's not straight up and down. If you look at it from a straight anterior view, it does look straight up and down because you can't see the curvature. But from a lateral view, it's really important to note that it has that curvature. And that's really important structurally because it gives it a lot more integrity. It gives it a lot more ability to absorb shock and kind of basically bounce when you're doing something like running or something like that. It just gives it more strength and flexibility when it's under stress. See a couple of hands. Grace, go ahead.
Just to make sure that I'm understanding right, so if we're looking at the one on the right, the head would kind of is on top of the facing this, right?
Yeah, and I wish I had a better, I'm glad you asked it. Yep, so this is a right lateral view. So this one is standing like this, the head facing that way. This is an anterior view, so this one is, yeah, thanks for that question. Ethan, do you have your hand up? Yeah.
The first was why we had so many back falls, right?
Really? Abnormal spinal curvatures. That's amazing. Did you? Wow. Okay. Man, I'm gonna buy a lotto ticket today and have you pick the numbers for me. You're gonna. All right. So there's a couple forms of abnormal spinal curvature I want you to know about, and so this doesn't actually directly address Ethan's question. These are kind of extreme cases. We also have just kind of the run-of-the-mill back problems. In our society, like Western society, industrialized society, is littered with back problems because we are absolutely terrible to our backs. And in fact, what all of you are doing right now is really not good for your back. Sitting is not, I mean, it can be overstated a little bit. Like we can sit some and have a healthy back, right? But especially sitting in chairs is like terrible for your back. And we do all kinds of other things that aren't good for our backs too. And so back problems are really prominent in kind of Europe, North America, and other Western societies. Having said that, there's also some more dramatic problems that arise from genetic disorders or developmental disorders. And so for one example is scoliosis. And this is an abnormal lateral curve. So remember, going back to the previous slide here, if we're looking at the spine straight on, it's straight up and down, right? There's curvature between front and back, between anterior and posterior, but there's no curvature from left to right. If you have that, then you have what's called scoliosis. And this is an extreme case. There's also, a lot of us probably have pretty mild cases of scoliosis in some way. And that's when the spine develops this lateral curvature. And that can cause a lot of problems because then your weight is distributed differently and it can put pressure on different aspects of the spine where it's not really strong enough to withstand that pressure. We also have something called kyphosis, which is when you get this exaggerated thoracic curvature. So remember, the thoracic curvature is this curvature right here. in your upper back, and especially in older folks, that the spinal column can become weak, and you get essentially this kind of hump in that area as the head kind of transitions forward, and that thoracic curvature becomes really exaggerated. We also have something called lordosis, which is when the lumbar curvature becomes exaggerated, essentially pushing your abdomen out to an extreme position. You see that here. This isn't terribly extreme. And this is sometimes called sway back as well. And I'm going to show you another slide coming up that explains how that can happen, especially during pregnancy as well. So I do want you to know 3 kinds of abnormal spinal curvatures. We've got scoliosis, which is the lateral curvature. We've got kyphosis, which is this exaggerated thoracic curvature. And we have lordosis, which is this exaggerated lumbar curvature. Let me just show you a little bit more detail here on kyphosis. So this can be caused by congenital defects. That means just kind of developmental, something doesn't happen properly during development. And what happens is the bone can lose its integrity, and as you get older, like as this curvature, what am I trying to say? As you get older, the curvature becomes worse because you put more weight on it. That causes more curvature. That causes you to put more weight on it. That causes more curvature. It's this kind of feedback. And so over time, it can create a lot of problems, and this kind of humpback condition can result. Lordosis can be also something temporary, and this happens to a lot of times when women are carrying children, because all of a sudden you've got an extra 20 plus pounds of weight in a very localized region of your body, in your abdomen. And to compensate for that shift in the center of gravity, the lower back will actually exaggerate that lumbar curvature over time, and that helps keep the center of gravity over the legs, right? So you don't fall over because you have a big mass in front of you. And so what that does is it kind of moves that back and moves the center of gravity back to where it should be. So this can cause lower back pain for pregnant women, especially late in pregnancy. But generally it's temporary. Once things clear up, then the spine will go back. So it's this kind of temporary lordosis caused by the added weight of a fetus developing in the uterus. Yes, Sarah.
Are these things kind of be also hereditary?
They can, well, are they hereditary? They can be genetic, but I don't know if they're hereditary. So by that, I specifically mean that you can, it can be caused by certain mutations when you're developing, but I don't know if those mutations are then transmitted down the somatic germline down the germline, if they're limited to the somatic tissue, or they're transmitted down the germline to your offspring. Another good question. I don't know the answer to that.
My mom has scoliosis, and I know in high school, like I had some serious like back pain, and I was a chiropractor and point out in my X-ray that I had like a serious curvature laterally, like if you can see it, it was quite bad. Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you get an X-ray of your back, right? Yeah.
Like you can, yeah. I don't know actually if it can be genetic. I would be surprised if it wasn't at least a little bit genetic. I'm sure that it's not like a straightforward thing. Like if your mom has scoliosis, you're gonna have scoliosis for sure. But it probably has some component of that. It seemed to make sense. Yeah, I had back problems a couple years ago, and they took X-rays, and they found like all of this stuff wrong with my back. Like wish they never took the X-rays. They're like, oh, you've got a little bit of scoliosis, and this is degenerating, and this is happening, and I was like, oh, it's crazy. Good question. Did I see another hand too? All right, what time do we got? I want to make sure we have time to do what I want us to do. Actually, that's probably a good place to stop for this part of class today. We'll get into the structure of these intervertebral discs coming up in the next class. What I want to do then is transition a little bit. So the beginning of the semester, the first week you took the survey, the ideological awareness survey. And I want to just talk about that in a little more detail because I did it in class. So what this is this is an effort by researchers at a couple different universities to incorporate, let's see, I'm just going to go ahead here. There we go. To incorporate a little more. Does someone need those slides back? Okay, I heard an exasperated sigh. Oh, there's just okay, cool. All right. I thought somebody was like, oh man, I was wondering about bones. Oh, I don't want to talk about this. No, and so what they're doing is they're working to incorporate kind of more cultural and historical issues into science curriculum. And they're doing this, there's folks at like 20 different universities across the country that are working on this curriculum. And so we have 3 kind of short lessons that we're going to do throughout this semester related to that, and also that tie in directly to our curriculum. And so the first one I'd like to look at is about tissue ownership. And this is in the context of the tissue types that we've been studying in lecture, and then also the tissue lab that you'll have next week. We were supposed to have last week, but we didn't. And so this is a pretty big and complicated issue. Basically, who owns, if a doctor cuts out part of your body, some of your tissue, and they save it, whose is it? Is it the doctor's? Is it the hospital's? Is it yours? What if you die? Do your kids have a right to it? What if they make a lot of money on that tissue? Who gets that money? Does the doctor get that money? Does the hospital get that money? Do you get that money? Super complicated issue. And I want to talk a little bit about it in class today. And then I have a reading for you over the weekend. It's only like 2.5 pages. It's short, but I think it'll get your wheels spinning a little bit about this. And I'll be honest, this is not an area that I'm an expert in. I'm kind of learning about this as I teach it. I've given a little bit of thought to this, but it's a very complicated kind of legal, ethical, medical issue. And I often don't often don't step into that kind of fray. I'm often just thinking about more of the biological side of things. And so biological samples can be collected for a number of reasons. So when I say a biological sample, I mean some aspect, some part of your body, cells. It can be anything from spitting saliva into a tube and getting a DNA sample to part of an organ or something like that. And they can be used for diagnosis or treatment. So sometimes they need to take what's called a biopsy, like a piece of tissue or an organ, and then look at it carefully in the lab to diagnose a potential medical problem. It also can be used for altruistic reasons. You can donate blood to somebody else. That's a tissue donation. You can donate a kidney to someone else or other body parts as well. And also you can donate parts of your body for research. Sometimes when you're living, often folks donate their bodies to science to be cadavers and dissection labs and things like that after they die. And so there's a lot of complicated issues around the legal issues of this. For example, you can donate your blood. Can you sell your blood? Can you sell it to just anybody? Can you sell your plasma? I don't know. Those are big questions that are regulated differently in different places. So the takeaway message here is that once you're just kind of thinking about tissue sample collection, and then what happens to that, where it goes, and who benefits from that, right? It seems a pretty clear-cut case that like you go and donate blood to the Red Cross, and then they use it to help someone survive a terrible car accident. Like that seems like generally a pretty good like win-win situation, right? You give up 15, 20 minutes of your time, you get some free orange juice, and then someone lives. Like that's kind of good for everyone. But what if you donated it to a company that turned around and used your blood tissues to make a drug that they then sold and made millions of dollars on and didn't give you anything? Like, there's a lot of kind of gray area in there. Sarah, go ahead. You had your hand up.
Oh, no.
You're just stretching again?
What, I need to stretch, I just
That's okay. Anyway. Okay, so there's some examples of this. These slides, actually, I'm not crazy about these slides, but I just want to run through a couple of examples quickly. You don't need to know the details of this, so I don't need you necessarily to take notes on this. I'm not going to ask you questions specifically about these case studies on quizzes or exams. I just want to get some big ideas rolling here. We're going to come back to these on Monday. So here's an example of a guy who had part of his spleen or all of his spleen removed back in 1976. He was subsequently asked for some tissue samples. He signed a consent form to use the samples for research. Then they used this tissue to develop this line of immune cells, T lymphocytes, which they patented, and they made $3 billion with a B dollars on this pharmaceutical innovation. This guy then sued and was like, hey, you took my cells and made $3 billion. Where's my cut? And it ended up being rejected, saying that he didn't actually have a right to make any of the money off of those cells. Another example is this guy who was working towards developing a cure or treatment rather for what's called Canavan disease. No, I'm sorry, not a treatment. They want to do a prenatal test for Canavan disease, which is basically well, here's a bunch of the symptoms of newborns. It's basically a bunch of very unpleasant things that can happen to newborn babies. So they wanted to be able to screen for this. And what he did is he got tissue samples, I believe from pregnant women. So it got blood, urine, and tissue samples. And then he was working on this test. And then what happened is he was working at a hospital, and there was some complication about whether he owned the rights to this or the hospital did. Basically, what ended up happening is it ended up being kind of this morass of the hospital and the doctor and the patients all kind of saying who has rights to this treatment. What makes it kind of complicated is at the end, the idea of it was very altruistic. The idea of it was to provide the screening test for this potentially like very harmful and even fatal disease in infants. Let's see, another example is this. Actually, here's just another example. I'm not going to walk through this one. Just looking at the time. Yep. So there's other examples of this. In the short article you're going to read from Monday talks about a few. And so what has arisen from these cases is a few kind of general rules about tissue collection. The first is that if you're donating biological material, you have a right to know how and where it's going to be used. And in particular, if it's going to be used in any kind of money-making scheme. Also, you have a right to, but the right to kind of control that material and determine who gets it and what's done with it ends after it's collected. So you can know ahead of time what's going to be done with it, but then as soon as it's collected, you kind of lose any control over where it goes. And so you can't claim ownership of that material. Once that part of your body leaves you and is collected, it's not yours anymore. This is maybe a little bit of a lighthearted thing, but when I had my hip replacement surgeries this past year, I really tried to convince the doctor. So what they do is like you have they cut, I'm not gonna show you, but they cut off the top of your femur. Basically, they just slice the whole thing off and they replace it. And I really wanted him to let me keep it. I was like, that'd be a sweet paperweight, but he wouldn't let me do it. So, and I was like, that's my hip. Like I should be able to keep it, but they couldn't let me keep it, which is weird because it's part of my body. Anyway, not that big a deal. He didn't make $3 billion on it. Maybe he did, I don't know. I want to know about that. And then finally, the other kind of general rule is that the recipient has the right to commercial exploitation of any products developing from the process. So basically is that the person who collects the tissue sample, in this case, the medical professional, has the kind of right to basically make something that makes money off of it. Now, a very famous example of this, and this is where most of my knowledge of this comes from, this book that came out a few years ago called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. How many of you have heard of this book or read it? Have you read it? Super good, super interesting read that gets into this in a really powerful way. The gist of it is that this poor Black woman in 1951 was being treated for cervical cancer, and they collected some cells from her cervix. And these cells were, they proved to be one of the first and one of the few cell lines of human cells that were immortal. So normally when you collect cells from a person, they collect fibroblasts or something like that. You can keep them in the lab, they'll grow and divide for a certain number of generations, and then they just kind of putter out. Her cervical cells lasted forever, like literally they're still going. And they were used in developing the polio vaccine and cloning and gene mapping. They were brought into space. They were used to develop cancer drugs, all of this stuff. And nobody ever told her or her family what was going on. Companies made millions and millions of dollars off of these cell lines, using these cell lines in their drug development, et cetera. And here her family was struggling economically and in a whole bunch of other ways. She ended up dying, she ended up living for a long time. She's no longer with us, unfortunately. The book goes through the author here, Rebecca, what's her last name? Scoot. Yeah, Rebecca Scoot. Thank you. She gets to know the family really well and one of Henrietta's daughters. It's a really compelling story. But basically, you can't but walk away from that thinking how unfair it was that they took these cells from her, didn't tell her, and then made a bunch of money off of it and all these scientific advances, and didn't give her not only any money, but any credit for any of that either. So it's an interesting case study. So with that in mind, I've got this 3-page paper for you to read for class on Monday. And as you read it, I have some very specific reflection questions. And these are all in your program for Monday. I don't need you to type out long answers to these reflection questions. What I'm interested in you is thinking about it and just kind of taking some notes. And then in class, we're going to kind of debate some of these issues. So I'm not going to collect anything written from you on this. Instead, we're going to engage with it on Monday. So the assignment is essentially to come to class Monday prepared to discuss those questions. So what I recommend doing is reading the questions first, then you can go and read the article, and then you can take some notes on it. I think the whole thing, I estimate that between the reading and the reflection, taking some notes, take you about an hour or so of work over the weekend. And that's all detailed on your program for Monday. We'll have a heated debate in here on Monday. Maybe not. I don't know. We'll see. Questions? Yes, you do. Okay, good, good. Not
Are we going to be tested on the material that we just covered for the we just talked about?
Great question. I'm glad you asked that. I am not going to include questions on this on your quizzes or exams. However, participating in the class debate will be worth class points on Monday. So I want to make that explicit. So I don't want you to be unmotivated to engage this material. It's not super long, and it will be part of what we important for what we do Monday, but I'm not going to ask you quizzes on quiz or exam questions on it. Does that answer your question?
Also, the stuff we just reviewed, are we gonna have it
Oh.
quiz as well, what we just went over in the slide.
So you're channeling Ethan right now. Here's quiz number 2. Is going to be next Friday, a week from today. That was impressive. And it will cover material from the last quiz. So starting on January 21st, which is the integumentary system, through what we'll cover on Monday. So it will cover what we talked about today, minus the tissue ownership, ethical stuff. And then also what we get into on Monday. The quiz will be worth 30 class points, and I don't know the format yet. So all of you completed a survey, I hope, before class today, indicating your preferences for quiz formats and things like that. I'm going to review that and then look at the material for this lecture, and I'll let you know on Monday what format the quiz will take. But I want you to know what material it covers and when it will be, so you can be prepared for that. Sarah, does that answer your question? All right, good. So last but not least, so we got perfect time here. This is your Friday Venn diagram. I've got a ticket out for you, just some questions from what we covered in class today, as well as an upload of your review diagram of the bone at the beginning of class. Please go ahead and complete that survey. Once you do that, you're good to go. I will stick around, of course, and answer any questions. Otherwise, have a great, fun, and safe weekend, everybody.